Here, the Humanitarian podcast, a podcast by Here Geneva.
My name is Hambye-Verbrugghen. Today on Here, I am joined by Balthasar Staehelin. Balthasar is the Director of Digital Transformation and Data at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you very much for your time and for sitting down with me today.
Pleasure.
It makes sense to start with the data breach from January.
Yeah, I can say a few words about it. So indeed, we realized in January 2022 that our systems had been attacked by a sophisticated cyber attack, and that data sets were breached of over 500,000 people. And these were actually data related to a family link network of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. We immediately informed the public very transparently, and of course also our partners, on that breach, also clearly deactivating the system, rebuilding it, reinforcing the security, and of course doing the whole work of reaching out to the partners who reached out to the data subjects. And up to today, we haven't had any indication that the data was published or traded. We haven't been approached with any kind of ransom demand, but we preferred to really communicate the worst case scenario, and that is that these data sets were exported. We don't know what was exported or exfiltrated, but unfortunately we have to start from the worst case assumption. They had the technical means to do so, and I think it's shown a spotlight on the fact that humanitarian actors are not exempt from cyber attacks, and that we need to be particularly careful about our cybersecurity. It's a challenge for humanitarian actors. It's a question also, what kind of degree of cybersecurity should humanitarian actors aim for? Are we looking at weapon grade kind of cybersecurity? We have to be extremely transparent about the standards we apply. We have to be very transparent when such an incident happens. And we have to, of course, as a protection actor, be very careful about the fallout. For us, our key concern was, of course, could harm come to the people whose data we have had in this system, and that is in a way the driving motivation where we try to mitigate the risks.
I mean, we are going to get into more detail in terms of the risk management, but I thought maybe it would be a good idea to just lay out the terms. I've seen the incident at the ICRC talked about both as a cyber attack and as a data breach. What's the difference between those two things?
I think that the cyber attack is an attack that could have different impacts on systems. It could be paralyze a system, for instance. That's what we see in ransom attacks. So you can hijack a system and people can't use it any longer. The screens are blocked, and very often that's of a criminal nature. And you can afterwards, of course, try to force an organization to then pay in order that the systems become accessible again. That may or not then be accompanied with an attack against your data. I think a data breach means that the systems, if I use the real world example of a wall is being breached, it means that people managed to get through your defensive walls and managed to get into the space where there is data. And that means that this data was accessed by non-authorized persons or entities or groups, and that you cannot exclude that they, on one hand, they can just have a look at specific data sets, but they can also, of course, exfiltrate data, can try to steal data. Now, they could theoretically also delete data, or they could simply copy it and leave the data behind. They could manipulate the data. So I think there is various forms of harm that could be inflicted upon your data.
This maybe spotlighted questions around data management and data security, but one of the things that came out quite a bit afterwards was the ICRC isn't the first organization to whom this has happened, they're just the first to speak about it. And so in light of all of this, what personal data do you think should agencies be collecting?
It's a very good question. I mean, one of the data protection principles is actually data minimization. So the idea is that you do not collect unnecessarily data, and that you are also, of course, very thoughtful about how you store it, where you keep it, how long you keep it, when do you delete it, that you spell out clear rules, clear commitments. And I think what we did at the ICRC is that we have very clear and publicly shared data protection standards, and that are independently monitored by an independent control commission that can also be seized by data subject if they feel that their rights have been infringed upon by the way we manage data. So we have, and it's perhaps ironic, been very forceful and arguing and pleading for a strong data protection. And in this sense, of course, I think it's the fact that we were ourselves now victim of a sophisticated cyber attack was for us a terrible blow. That's clear. It was a shock. But I hope that this attack, but also the way we tried to lead by example in terms of transparency, provides a catalyst for the humanitarian sector to really take this issue of humanitarian data and how we best protect it very seriously. And I think there is an element also of a non-attack. In the physical world, the ICRC, its delegations, its staff, tries to convince people not to attack it in the first place. We don't have military escorts, if you allow me this parallel. We go around the world in our cars, and our best defense is actually that belligerents do not attack us in the first place. And that very often can be belligerents, but it can also be criminal groups. We depend on this acceptance. And I think if we transmit that now into cyberspace, I'm not sure that cybersecurity efforts of humanitarian organizations will always be stronger than sophisticated attackers. I think there are certain actors that have a sophistication, and we see it, that they can penetrate even defense establishments. So it is very difficult for a humanitarian organization to get to that level. So I think part of our security in that cyberspace is also convincing people not to attack us in the first place, as we do in the physical world. And all these efforts go hand in hand and have to be as transparent as possible.
Yeah. Still on the collection aspect, who do you think should be collecting the data? So I was reading this report by GPPI, I think it was issued this year, where they explained that a lot of the time it's implementing partners who collect the data, but then it's not the implementing partners who are sharing the data afterwards and sharing it back up for reporting purposes with donors. So how do you factor that in? Because obviously it diffuses chain of command isn't the right term, but you get what I mean.
No, it's an excellent question. So as I said, clear standards are important, and standards also have to be clear on who actually, manages the data and has the accountability for the management of the data, for the handling of the data. The data ultimately belong to what you call in jargon the data subjects, which are really the people whose data we here talk about if we talk about personal data. So they are the owner of the data as data subjects. But there are clear responsibilities. Now, ICRC, we do not have a model contrary to some of the big UN agencies where we essentially work through implementing partners, but we have 20,000 women and men in some 100 countries around the world, and we do most of our activities ourselves. So in this sense, the implementing partner issue is not a key issue for us, because for the ICRC data, we do have, in a way, it's our own staff doing it. But what is interesting, that the system that was breached is a system of family links. And in order to re-establish family, you need, of course, various partners, and the Red Cross and the Red Crescent network with over 190 national society, Red Cross and Red Crescent society in different countries. A number of these societies, over 60, use the system. So indeed, the system that was breached was actually containing data that were managed essentially by national societies, and that added a certain complexity to the crisis.
Mm-hmm. So how do you ensure a principled approach to humanitarian data?
I think what you have to do is try to be thoughtful about how you manage and process the data. And that means also that the technological solutions that you use have to be well assessed through data protection impact assessment. So typically before we deploy any tool, we must make a data protection, that is standard practice at the ICRC, a data protection impact assessment. What does it actually mean for the people, and what kind of technology can we use to be in sync with the data protection rules? So of course, in the first place, you need to have policies on these issues, and I believe also that a responsible approach is that these policies are openly shared with the public, that they can also see against which standard do you hold yourself accountable for. And of course, another big part of it is indeed that you try to do what you can with regard to the cybersecurity to be state of the art and that you are also very transparent with the people you try to protect and assist in terms of rules that are applicable. Now, there are, of course, difficulties. If you, say, go into a besieged city with a team of 4 people and they have to try to take under fire, bring medical supplies to a hospital, and you talk to people, how can you explain what are your rules? If you talk to them, if you take any kind of data from them, I think in the heat of humanitarian action, it's not always easy, and it begs really the question also of the digital literacy of people in war zones. How much do they have an understanding? Even in peaceful societies, people often are quite flippant about data protection, don't really understand the systems, technology, the subtitles of it. Yeah. So I think there are limits of how far you can do that in the heat of action, but I think at least you should have a responsible way of striving constantly to walk the talk and to be also very transparent about rules and how you strive to implement them.
We'll get a chance to come back to digital literacy in the next episode of the podcast.
But so the DPIA, that's at the project or program design phase. You said that was standard ICRC policy. Do you know if that's the case for other international organizations?
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure it's necessarily a standard because you need experts to do so. So you need, of course, a data protection setup of experts and you need certain rules. So I would, before you come to the impact assessment, I would sort of say how many of the humanitarian organizations have data protection rules and policies, and then how do they try to implement them, and then in the implementation phase, you come to the data protection impact. So I would even ask the question at a high level, how many of the organizations have policies, and then how have they equipped themselves to implement those? And perhaps the third part is who verifies that this implementation takes place. And I believe there are different degrees of maturity among organizations on data protection, but I see a growing interest and a growing move towards going towards such standards. I think the humanitarian organizations will increasingly be challenged and held accountable on how they manage data. And it is, for me, today part of being a professional humanitarian organization that you have these standards. But I don't think that everybody has these rules and the capacity to implement them.
Do you think that the EU bringing GDPR into force has had an impact, will have an impact? Because some of these organizations are operating out of EU states.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a very interesting one to sort of see how regulation goes. And you see typically in the USA, you see certain states at state level who have legislation that are actually very close to the rules applicable in Europe. And it becomes, I spoke to tech companies who basically said it's very complicated. We would rather have one standard for the whole of the USA than having different standards at state level. So I think there is probably a overall movement towards greater regulation on data protection. There isn't a one world standard. Now, are the European rules, have they been an accelerator to invest in data protection? Absolutely. For us, clearly it was also an important challenge that in order to keep our capacity to transfer data from war zones to European countries where often families live and need to find each other, it was very important that we can also handle data, continue to process data across international border, and that meant also that the investment in data protection, I think that the fact that there is clear regulation provides an impetus and an accelerator for people who need to process data from or towards European countries. And that is clearly also the case for the Red Cross and Red Crescent network on family links.
Yeah. And so what role do you see for governments in terms of the question of them helping to build or enable a regulatory environment? But that's not the only role that they could play. And what happens if governments asked for data to be handed to them? And I will have a follow-up question in terms of donors specifically, but I'll let you answer this.
I think the governments have, it's a very large question. I mean, of course, governments have a certain responsibility to regulate, I feel, the way data is managed in their given context. Now, with regard to humanitarian data, I believe what we need to strive for is an international consensus that independently, I would sort of say, of now national legislation that still differ considerably between different countries, that we manage to forge a consensus that humanitarian data should be protected, should not be attacked, but also should not be used for any other purpose. Humanitarian organizations depend on the trust of the people they try to to serve. And if we can't guarantee to people that the data that we collect will not be used against them, which is a way of reinterpretation of the do no harm principle. We have in the humanitarian sector for decades had a do no harm principle. I think we have to transpose this do no harm principle into the digital space and sort of say, how can we ensure as a humanitarian sector, as a humanitarian community, that what we do doesn't cause unintentionally harm? And in the digital space, that needs an understanding of technology, of impact of technology. But we can't control it all ourselves as humanitarian actors. There's part of it that we can control and that we should control. But there are also parts of it where we have to, I believe, lobby and convince states to basically refrain from asking humanitarian actors to share data that then would be used for any other purpose than humanitarian. Now, ICRC, we have privileges and immunities. We have a clear-cut mandate under the Geneva Convention, under international humanitarian law, which shields us to a certain extent against attempts to take our data lawfully and use it against people. But the humanitarian sector, not all organizations have these privileges and immunities. So I think there should be a larger debate on ensuring that sort of the sanctity of humanitarian action is also respected in the digital space. And it's a little bit more complex because you see it if an NGO gets attacked, if someone gets killed, if someone gets kidnapped, if someone's delegation gets broken in, or you see it less if it happens in the digital space. It's perhaps less easy to grasp, but it's a variation of the same theme.
You mentioned when you say international standards, because I'm going to make a parallel with GDPR again, and with what you mentioned earlier about having, what is it? Is it a supervising kind of?
Yeah, we have an independent commission, a control commission on our own handling of the data protection.
When you say independent commission, so they're not part of ICRC?
That's correct. It's a mixed commission. There are some members of our governance and there are some external members.
Okay. Do you think if the humanitarian community needs to strive towards international standards, should they also strive towards a kind of supervisory authority of humanitarian data in the same way that is meant to exist under GDPR?
I'm not absolutely sure that the solution is a sort of centralized supervisory body, but I think in order to be credible, organizations with their specific mandates should at least clearly be able to be in a position to show how they, not only what kind of rules they play with, but also how do they have these rules verified. It's interesting, it echoes a little bit, even if it's a very different theme, the issue of sexual misconduct in the humanitarian sector, and how do you ensure that rules that people stand for are being implemented. There was also discussion, should there be one centralized supervisory body? I'm not a big believer that these centralized bodies really are the best solution forward, but I think humanitarian organizations should really be able to convincingly explain on how they have found solutions to really apply these rules and do so. But if I may open a slight tangent remark, I think the kind of requirements to be a responsible humanitarian operator in today's world are going up. I've seen it for over 20 years, and it becomes more and more complex to, in a way, meet all these requirements that are required from us today. And I think also in the whole issue of localization of smaller organizations, it becomes more and more stressful to be an operator, and all the systems and processes and rules and policies and supervision that you should have in place can become a real challenge for a smaller operator to lift it. So I think there is an issue of knowledge transfer, of cooperation, of joint learning in order that this doesn't become a threshold that is so high that it sort of squeezes out smaller organizations.
This is actually a great seek to my next question, because it is the implementation of those processes is partially donor driven. And so my question is, going back to the question earlier about the role for governments, how feasible do you think it is that the same governments who set all of these processes and reporting mechanisms that are incredibly heavy and incredibly bureaucratic, how feasible is it for it to be these same governments who establish the regulatory frameworks? Isn't there some contradiction between them saying we want all of this data collected and fed back to us? Does it make sense to expect them to be the ones saying, actually, you shouldn't be collecting that much data? Or do you think that push for the regulatory framework needs to come from within?
It's quite a few different questions. Perhaps a first remark is that if I sort of look at our trajectory, our investment in data protection preceded any donor pressure. So I think we invested in it and became a voice arguing for the importance of data protection before there was any pressure from government.
Can I ask where that stemmed from? Was it
as I said, one of the operational considerations was really, we realized more and more that the transfer of data, it came from an operational problem. We realized more and more that as an organization that works around the world and needs that data circulated, has since the inception of the ICRC, we have always had a lot of sensitive data. So it was actually our protection practitioners, what we call protection, the people who work on family links, to work to influence the conduct of hostilities, who visit detainees, who collect a lot of sensitive data of victims of sexual violence or whatever, who really have highly sensitive data. And we also realized this data, in order that we have humanitarian impacts, sometimes has to cross the boundaries of a given context. So it came from a very practical problem on how can we ensure, in a world where more and more regulation comes about and where we need to be more and more careful because this data sits in places where it could also be attacked and seized, how do we solve that whilst maintaining the trust of the people we try to serve? So it was actually the operational protection problem of the operators on the ground that was a catalyst of an institutional reflection to sort of say we need to find forward-leaning solutions, which is a mixture, of course, of standards, of walking the talk, of raising concerns of the humanitarian sector for the issue, because it goes beyond the ICRC. Perhaps, so it came from the practitioners, actually, and then more and more became then a setup that also produces, of course, policy that tries to influence the sector, that engages in research and development to find solutions, because some of the commercially available solutions aren't always totally adequate for it. Now, I think there are differences between organizations. Some organizations, if you are, say, an organization purely doing relief to communities and you hardly collect any personal data, the kind of data sets that you need to collect in the exercise of your function may be less delicate than if you visit prisoners of war, detainees, political detainees, persecuted people in war zones. So I think there are different degrees of sensitivity around the data that different actors collect. I think in a natural catastrophe, perhaps the risk of misuse of data against people is a little bit lower than if you're in a war zone. So I think we have also to always look at it from what is an organization doing, and that's exactly the risk assessment. You need to really look at the risk and assess the risks for the people, and then find the right solutions and the right mitigation measures. There is no one size fits all. And also, in a way, the standards that government sets, I don't believe today that donor governments, for the time being, exercise an enormous pressure on organizations to invest in data protection. I don't see it.
Do you think they should?
I believe it will come. I think it has, at the very least, to be on the table as a policy consideration, to sort of say, depending on what kind of organization I finance and I support, and the kind of data, it has to be on the table, depending on the sensitivity, depending on whether personal data is being collected or not. It's not every humanitarian actor will necessarily collect personal data. I think there are humanitarian actors who essentially work on systems and hardly have any personal data. So I think that we really have to look at it at a case-by-case basis. But if a humanitarian organization collects a lot of sensitive data, personal data, it should absolutely be part of a dialogue. And I think donors have to ask these questions. And yes, I believe that the responsibility of people collecting personal data, independently now of the applicable jurisdiction, needs to be addressed. For me, it's part of today's overall professional attitude that you should have.
And on that note,
Balthasar, thank you so much for joining me today.
thank you for tuning in to this episode of Here, the Humanitarian podcast. This podcast is available on Spotify or YouTube. To find out more about our work, please visit here-geneva.org, follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn at HereGeneva, or subscribe to our YouTube channel.